Hello, everyone. Welcome to CultureTalk, where we share insights and learnings from leaders in arts and culture. Today, we're exploring the intersection of content strategy and cultural engagement with Georgina Brooke, Senior Content Strategist at One Further. One Further are a digital agency that help cultural organisations analyse and improve their digital presence, working with institutions like the British Museum, Tate, and Shakespeare Globe. Georgina brings extensive experience from roles at Oxford University, National Museum Scotland, and the Ashmolean Museum, where she's developed a deep understanding of how content strategy can empower cultural organisations to reach wider audiences. Hi, Georgina. Thanks for joining us today. I'd normally ask how you are, but I know you're struggling with a bit of a cough at the moment. So I'm also dealing with a bit of a sniffles from hay fever. So I'm sure people can bear with us for this episode.
Yeah.
But yeah, I trust you've been all right. Otherwise, before we get on to talk about content strategy, could you share a bit about your background and what led you to specialise in content for the cultural sector?
Yeah, sure. I don't think there's any sort of one career path into content, and mine certainly isn't super linear. So I did classics at university, which is ancient history. I specialised in Greek, but it's the ancient culture, so Greek and Latin. So looking at society from all sorts of angles, but essentially that doesn't really qualify you for anything. So I applied to all sorts of things out of university, and the first job I got was project manager for a agency in London called Reading Room. But they were a multinational agency, so as well as having offices in London, they also had offices in Singapore and Australia and places like that. And when I'd been there for maybe 6 months or so, working out of the London office, I got asked if I'd like to go out and train in the Singapore office, and I did, and really enjoyed it, and then relocated to Singapore for a year and a half. And because that office was moving a lot more quickly and growing a lot more quickly, I got a lot of opportunities in that office that I wouldn't have done in the London office, and was able to move out of just project managing website builds into more analytical things like content and getting to grips with analytics, and sort of trying to work out a bit more the science about what makes a web page good and how you can track it, what effective KPIs are, all of that good stuff. And then around that time, the London office won a bit of work working with the Government Digital Service, who at that time were working on the beta launch of gov.uk. So this was before gov.uk and the Government Digital Service and content design had as much kind of presence or were as well known as they are today. And also what's not very well publicised is that they did outsource some of that work for gov.uk, and Reading Room London was one of the agencies that helped with that outsourced work. So I came back to London to work on that project, which is good fun. But when I moved back to England, I bought with a very large mortgage a very, very small house in Oxford, and then was very, very poor and commuting into London on the Oxford Tube, which is a bus. And it was just kind of killing me. I was getting up at like 5 in the morning or something. So I got a better job involving less of a commute for Oxford University. And shortly after I'd been hired, my boss went on maternity leave, and it took them a little while to fill her post. So I was in a new job, didn't really have a boss. And so I could kind of do what I wanted to. It was called digital content editor. And I was like, what could I do to make Oxford University kind of more interesting? You know, we're a massive research institution, supposedly with the cleverest people in the world. So I decided to do little interviews around topics I found interesting and thought the general public would find interesting, like how to live a happy life. And I talked to like a researcher in Buddhist studies, a psychologist, a psychiatrist, and kind of pieced together their different answers for these kind of quite broad questions coming from their research. So that was fun on the kind of web content side of things. And then I also did social media, which wasn't a massive job at that point. I set up the Oxford University Instagram at the time when I didn't have a boss, and that wasn't really a big deal. And it went on to be the most followed UK university on the channel, but that also wasn't it probably only had about 10,000 followers at that point. It was a kind of different world in terms of social media back in the day. So I did that job for quite a while, and then towards the end I was getting a bit bored, and the focus was increasingly on social media. And yeah, I didn't just want to be a social media manager. So I had a short-term role for a startup for 3 months in London, back in London. And then a job came up at the Ashmolean, where they had just invested a load of money trying to build their own content management system within Oxford University. So the Ashmolean's part of Oxford University. But whilst the use cases they'd used that content management system for so far were all quite academic, it was building like the history faculty website, the theology faculty website, that kind of thing. And it wasn't very pretty. So it might have worked for quite motivated users that needed to find specific bits of academic information, but it wasn't going to sell tickets. So I came in and worked with the in-house development team to be the kind of audience advocate in agile terms, and do a bunch of audience research about what museum visitors needed from a content management system, and work with them to modify the functionality. And we couldn't have everything. We had to do a kind of must have, should have, could have about what functionality we were going to prioritize. And then I had to build all of the content on the website, and create templates and training, because I was only fixed term, so that after I left, the website could carry on evolving and the teams in-house would know what to do and keep it looking nice and know how to measure things and all of that good stuff. So I did that for the Ashmolean, and they liked what I'd done. So then they asked me to do the same thing for the other 5 sites that, so that's the Garden, and then there are another 3 museums, so 5 in total, including the Ashmolean, that sit there. So I did that, and then I shortly had a permanent job at Oxford University Museum of Natural History, but then my partner got a permanent job at the opposite end of the country in Newcastle. So that was September 2019. So I was looking for jobs at the other end of the country, but really wasn't finding anything on an equivalent salary in Newcastle. But then a job came up in Edinburgh at National Museum Scotland, digital media content manager. It was only fixed term because the person that had the permanent version of that role wanted to go on secondment for 2 years and wasn't sure if they wanted the job when they came back. So anyway, I applied for that job, got that job, started in January 2020. Then, of course, in 2020, we all went into lockdown. So I moved out of my rental in Edinburgh and back in with my partner in Newcastle. We got engaged, and basically I didn't want to go back to commuting all of the time. And I was on this fixed term contract, and 2020 was a bit of a mad year in terms of recruitment, redundancies and recruitment freezes and things. We were recruiting someone at National Museum Scotland on an entry level role. I think it was about £20,000 a year, and 650 people applied, including people that were more senior than me. It was just a really insecure time to be on fixed term contracts. So I wanted to get out of that contract, and got headhunted for supposedly a permanent role in Newcastle as a project manager for a design and build agency. So I took that because I felt I couldn't really turn it down. But then a few days before I was due to start, I think on like New Year's Day or something, they called me up and said that they didn't actually have the money for the salary and that I would get 2 weeks severance pay. And at this point, I'd given up like my civil service pension scheme. I'd given up like all of my National Museum Scotland perks. So that was a bit enlightening in terms of how little security you have in a situation like that. But I'd put on Twitter that I was making this move back in the days when Twitter was a functional platform. And Chris, my current boss, had got in touch to say, I hope it works out. We're hoping to recruit for something similar. So then when it didn't work out, I was like, I'll just let Chris know I'm available. And then I literally started later that week. So that's worked out really well. I mean, it was really unexpected. There wasn't exactly like a job advertised that I went for. I'd spent years of my life writing like tens and tens of pages of job applications. And yeah, this is the longest that I've been in a job. I've been here since January 2021. And yeah, no looking back. So
it's funny how things work out. I mean, job security is one of those things that we kind of take for granted, but it can be so scary so quickly. So, I'm glad to hear that it's worked out so well at One Further. And yeah, I mean, we work closely with the guys at One Further, so it's a great place to fall into. There's a few things interesting there in your story that I feel like a lot of arts marketers and culture marketers will kind of relate to. And one of that is being a kind of like solo person or a small team dealing with content, which is quite a big job, is one thing which we might come on to later, how you manage that. But the other aspect as well that you kind of touched on is how content encompasses so much. And that's perhaps a good starting point for our conversation, because content is such a vague term, especially in the digital landscape. I mean, I use it quite lazily myself, but it can mean all kinds of things. And sometimes we kind of lose sight of what we actually mean by content. So, to help lay the foundations for this conversation, could you help clarify what do we mean by content?
Sure. Well, I would firstly just agree that I think we use both, as a senior content strategist, I think we use both content and strategy in a pretty woolly way in the sector. So I sort of think that my job is pretty much what everyone in the culture sector thinks of as content strategy, which is a much broader definition than outside of the culture sector. Like I feel when I was working in an agency in sort of private sector, content strategy has a kind of narrower focus. But in culture, it really means a whole bunch of stuff. So yeah, it can mean web content, it can mean social media. It really just means media. It can be YouTube content. It is a kind of big, baggy term, but I don't know what a better one is really.
Yeah, I think that's why we're at this stage, isn't it? No one's come up with a good alternative yet. Um, and you mentioned strategy being a kind of woolly term as well, and a large part of our conversation today will be about content strategy. But why is content strategy important, and what is it you're trying to achieve with content strategy when you're working with cultural organizations?
I think the main reason content strategy is important is because there's just so much content on the internet. I think yeah, a lot of us are trained to think that, or the way that we're educated is, you write what you find interesting, what's in your head, and you publish it, and a teacher marks it, and that's how you go about writing things. But that's not how the internet works, and there's just such like a ridiculous volume of content published to the internet every day. I do this one presentation where even in the course of like saying a sentence, something like 10,000 videos or 10,000 hours of video will be uploaded to YouTube. It's just kind of mind boggling. So if you don't have a strategy with putting your content up, it's very likely that it will do very little and go and not go very far, because yes, the internet does technically connect you to millions and millions of audiences, but there is billions and billions of bits of content on the internet. So it's very much not the case of build it and they will come. You need a bit of nous as to how you're pitching that content, who you're targeting it at. You need to kind of understand how the algorithms work and why you're choosing to put it on a particular platform. There's a whole bunch of stuff that you kind of want to get to grips to, which isn't taught in any kind of formal course or education before you start making too many plans. So I think it's just because it's an incredibly competitive landscape that not having a strategy means you are pretty likely to fail.
Yeah, I mean that's the crux of the issue when it comes to content strategy, isn't it? I want to dive into that in a moment, but I just want to go back to earlier you mentioned classics. I just picking up on it because I studied it at school and college too, and it's rare to come across a classics graduate. But I find it fascinating that so many of the storytelling techniques and themes pioneered by the likes of Aesop, Sophocles, and Homer are still being used today. And I wonder, how has your knowledge of classics influenced your approach to content and storytelling in the cultural sector?
I don't know if it has that directly. I mean, I guess it's sometimes nice and a bit nerdy to know the etymology of words, but maybe more broadly, I think what attracted me to classics is that you're studying a civilization from lots of different angles. So philosophy, history, art, language, literature. And I feel like that kind of curiosity and sort of seeking to find continuums of the human condition is maybe not entirely dissimilar from content strategy, where you really need a deep empathy for the user and a kind of imagination about what they might be after, or if you're extrapolating data from research, how you might interpret one insight from a qualitative study and think about how that more broadly applies. And I think a lot of what motivates me about the culture sector, and well, I suppose specifically museums, which is more what I've specialised in, is thinking about society at large. And there's not all that much, I think, to get very excited about in terms of like government and to some extent like society, the environment. You know, there's a lot that's quite kind of scary and, to be honest, depressing in the world. But I think if there's hope to be found anywhere and things to sort of believe in that's bigger than yourself, I feel like in a fairly sort of atheistic society, culture's got to form a pretty big part of that. So probably the same things that drew me to classics are the things that keep me in culture. So not necessarily being that concerned about having a high salary or getting the most vocational experience ever, but more sort of having a kind of abstract interest in the human condition, and yeah, what motivates people and what brings them together, that kind of thing.
Yeah. You mentioned the big challenge with content strategy is the just abundance of content out there and the very many channels. And it feels like we live in a really complicated era these days. Maybe this is me because I just feel a bit old school and traditional. But there was a time when writers and creators were privileged roles to hold, and there were only so many channels where those people could reach the public. And in some ways, it's great that anyone can now have a platform, but in other ways, let's be honest, it's slightly terrifying and massively damaging to society. But besides that societal impact, the communications impact is that it's now so hard for anyone to cut through the noise, even if you have something really compelling to say. The cultural sector is perhaps better placed than others in terms of having something interesting to say and share. But what do you see as the unique challenges of creating culture for cultural organizations compared to more commercial businesses?
I think often it's getting the right balance of skills. I mean, not to say that for-profit companies necessarily have a great handle on this all the time. But if I think about a platform like YouTube and I look at like YouTube creators, so they're not exactly, they're not big companies like kind of BP or whatever, but they are, I mean, they're more freelancers, but they're essentially working for themselves in a for-profit model, and they understand, it's their job to understand how the YouTube algorithm works, to come up with a strategy for how they're going to cut above the noise, to optimize their thumbnails, to understand the keyword research. And I think those skills are quite difficult to recruit for within the culture sector. And that maybe that's partly because our salaries aren't that good. Maybe that's partly because the recruitment panel don't always know what they're looking for. And there are and part of it is maybe the nature of being part of a big institution. So I don't think this is unique to the culture sector, but the recruitment process tends to be quite formulaic. So you'll have this massive list of job requirements that you need to write a really robust answer for how you fulfill. And a lot of the criteria will be like ability to use Microsoft Word and ability to be a team player and lots of things that actually, for that particular job, for making amazing YouTube content, you don't need at all. And half the time you might like need a degree or something like that, which for making great YouTube content, again, you don't need a degree to create great YouTube content. So I think it's partly maybe our recruitment, and maybe it's a little bit cyclical too, in that we've got a few examples of museums creating amazing, in this case, YouTube content, but it's, if you want to become a YouTube creator, the most obvious thing to do is put all your energy into that. So yeah, I think it's partly skills and partly that our recruitment processes don't always, they probably bias in favor of recruiting more people that are similar to the existing set than getting in new skills and new approaches and people with perhaps more non-traditional experience, but that's more actually directly related to the kind of KPIs museums want to achieve.
It's a really great point you mentioned there about the skills. I mean, I feel like a lot of people miss the point when it comes to what it means to be a content creator, a storyteller, a writer, a content strategist. Writing is a non-negotiable, but it's almost not that important, I would say. What would you say, if you were hiring someone, is the single biggest skill set you're looking for when you're looking for a content strategist or a content creator or storyteller?
I think it really depends on the role because, when I started out, when I was doing social media, it was a different landscape, and Twitter was a much more important platform. And a lot of it was to do with text and image posts, and anyone could do that. And a lot of people, I suppose, with sort of degrees like classics, like me and Adam from the Merle, created content that was kind of funny and irreverent, but it wasn't necessarily very technically complicated to create. It wasn't like we were having to video edit or anything like that. Whereas now I feel like the landscape shifted, and there are still some people that are doing great work sort of on their mobile phones, and a platform like TikTok, I think, has become quite a leveler in that there is a lot of kind of overnight success from people that just really get the platform and are shooting it on their mobile, and it doesn't really require a specialist skill. It's just a kind of nous and being the familiarity with the platform and being on TikTok for a really long time, and getting used to the trends and things. So I think it really depends what you're hiring for. So I'd look for very different things for a content strategist, and I'd look for different things even within content strategists depending on who I was hiring for. And it would be different again for like a content designer, it'd be different again for like a social media strategist, different again for like a YouTube creator. So I think that's also part of the trouble, is that roles, what a museum might need from a role, will evolve quite a lot. And although there is a reasonable degree of turnover in the sector, there's also the case that some people stay in those jobs for a really long time. And what the museum needs from a certain role will evolve over the course of 5-10 years. And then it's difficult to pivot that if you don't have the kind of skills that like the next 5 years want from that role. So yeah, it's not a very precise answer.
No, I mean, getting back to what we're saying is saying it's a very small term for what encompasses a very diverse range of roles. So I think that's one of the things that a lot of people miss out on. Going on to your experience working with organizations on strategy, you worked with organizations like Tower Bridge on digital audience development. Could you share an example of how content strategy helped them to connect with wide audiences?
Yeah, so we did some interesting work with Tower Bridge. It isn't entirely wrapped up yet. So the first bit of work was interviewing lots of their audiences, because they already had an organizational strategy, and their organizational strategy at that point was focusing on getting more local interest. So Tower Bridge is on the kind of top 10 things to do if you go on TripAdvisor. It's got huge interest with tourists. It's on the London list. If you get a kind of multi-card of things to do in London, Tower Bridge is on that. But it doesn't have a huge amount of uptake amongst local residents, even though if you are in one of the 3 nearest boroughs to Tower Bridge, you can get in for £1, but hardly anyone knows that, even people that live in those boroughs. So there was part of the strategy that was trying to boost kind of hyper-local take-up, and the sort of value of the bridge to the immediate community. They were also interested in boosting their presence amongst STEM organisations, so some of the local universities and some companies that were interested in working in STEM. So we did a bit of research around that. That broadened out into STEAM, so including arts audiences. We did some separate audiences around that. And we looked at all of their existing audiences, so their e-news and social media and things like that. And we came up with what we called the Digital Audience Index, and there was a separate agency looking at in-person audiences. and came up with a kind of multi-pronged strategy. So we identified audiences where they could grow their influence to some extent. I mean, they have a fairly fixed capacity in terms of their in-person audiences, but in terms of their remote audiences and the potential value of things like their virtual schools software, that has definite potential to grow. But then at the other end of the scale, which I feel like the sector is a bit more likely to forget about, they had a really dedicated e-news recipient list that were crying out for reasons to visit the bridge. Again, reasons to visit the bridge at night, doing like wine and cheese tasting on the bridge. So what we got from the research was, yes, a lot of ways that they could grow new audiences, but also there was a strong appetite and the potential to make some money from their loyal audiences. So giving them reasons to come back to the bridge, reasons to celebrate the bridge, basically to convert those people that were following them on the email list to kind of fans and super fans. So yeah, I mean, it's still underway. There have been quite a few changes of staff. We're still working with them, but that was where the strategy landed.
And just zooming out a bit, and perhaps looking at other examples, what would you say makes a truly effective content strategy for cultural organizations?
I think it really means it depends what you mean by content strategy. So my definition of content strategy, I think, well, the one that I reference the most is from Richard Rummelt, who wrote Good Strategy, Bad Strategy, and his definition is that a strategy is a coherent direction as a result of an accurate appraisal of the forces at play. It's something like that anyway. So I think a lot of the ways that we sometimes get strategy wrong is it will be too future focused. It won't be based on the situation that you're in right now, and it will be too kind of positivistic. It won't be looking at what's not working at the moment and who it's not working for. And it'll also tend to come up with sort of 10, 12, 15 different areas of focus, whereas really a strategy should just be, this is the main concerning forces at play at the moment, and this is how we're going to address that specific thing. So I feel like the kind of corporate strategic plan, where you're kind of encompassing all aspects and trying to come up with like little action plans for every team in your sort of 500-person organization, is a bit of an anathema compared to the original, really targeted, really defined version of content strategy. So I've seen quite a lot of content strategies, or, you know, we get a lot of potential work and inquiries about content strategies. And some of them aren't really content strategies at all. Some of them are sort of content design projects where they want you to sort out the website. Some of them are social media strategies. But again, it kind of depends what you're trying to do with social media. Yeah, some of those projects that we get, I think, are strategic and some of them are less so. And I think one of the things that is an issue in the sector is how digital is seen. So a lot of the time, I think what we're really trying to do for clients is put digital on the map as having a strategic function, because it's been kind of sidelined as a service department. But that has its own challenges, particularly if you don't know from the outset that's actually the project that you're being brought in for. Because if you don't have buy-in from the most senior levels, and those levels you're not being invited to talk to, then it's quite difficult to actually implement the changes. So you can come up with a strategy, but that's not the same as implementing that strategy and actually making it real. And I think sometimes that's the hardest bit, is the delivery. And that was Government Digital Services' whole motto. The strategy is delivery. And I think in big, large organizations where there are so many moving parts and sometimes some not entirely helpful politics at play, that bears out.
So would you say being specific and focusing on a smaller set of problems or challenges is better than, obviously having that larger view is important sometimes, and that's maybe for more leadership roles, but when it comes to delivering, really you want to be specific, it seems.
Yeah, I think it depends whether we're talking about organizational strategy or content strategy more generally. I think organizational strategies are funny because there are sort of they're a bit of a mix of like mission and vision and future facing stuff. I've seen very few where it's like, these are the key challenges that we need to address. And maybe it's partly because they don't want to rock the boat. You know, they're not going to publish a strategic plan that says they've got a deficit or something like that. And they're trying to come up with some direction that unites the whole museum staff. Whereas if, you know, your key issue actually affects one particular bit of staff, then it makes less of a sort of shiny, all-encompassing PDF. So I find overarching strategic plans quite useful sometimes if I'm trying to justify where content sits in what the organization as a whole is trying to achieve. But again, yeah, it kind of depends what your project's actually about. And yeah, if you're trying to implement it, then you kind of need to know what the barriers to implementing that change are going to be. And sometimes you don't always get a sense of that until you're sort of 90% of the way through the project, or sometimes you don't get a sense of that until you've finished the project, or you don't get a sense of it full stop. But you're just aware that actually getting this change rolled out is not proving a smooth process. I can't remember what your opening question was to this. I feel like I've gone off on a bit of a tangent.
It was just around effective digital strategy in general, but I think we've covered a lot there. Just moving on to funding now. Funding is such a crucial aspect of many kind of venues' communication strategy, but cultural organizations sometimes struggle to articulate why someone should support them. What makes for compelling messaging that clearly communicates value beyond just supporting culture?
I suppose it kind of depends if you mean like donation type funding, or if you're
What kind of goes beyond that? Yeah, exactly. What around donations and especially for museums.
Yeah. So I ran quite an interesting article that was written by Rachel Maplebeck, who's a fundraising consultant. And she's done some nice work around, the newsletter post was called How to Create a More Effective Fundraising Page. Because in my experience, the kind of support us page on the site tends to be the least visited one at all. You know, it'll be one of the main navigation items, but almost always it'll get the least traffic. And not all that much thought, from my experience, often goes into that page. I think it's because fundraising copy tends to require a certain amount of sign off, or we think it's someone else's job, or that person whose job it is hasn't really delivered, or doesn't really understand what is needed from an online page. I think the best examples are ones where they really articulate what the value of that donation is. And we're doing quite a lot of work for British Heart Foundation at the moment. And I'm working on the research page at the moment. And one of the things BHF wants to improve is its perception as a research institution. You know, everyone knows Cancer Research UK is a research institution. The British Heart Foundation does a similar amount of research, has been doing it for arguably longer, depending on whether it's kind of complicated, but it doesn't have the same perception on the high street. So how you articulate the value of a donation and what that can do is important. And I think the better museums that do this are able to articulate what's unique about their institution and what your support allows them to do. And if you can do that at different tiers, then that's so much the better too, so that you're not just incentivizing the higher levels. But I think also maybe I think the sector should also think about these things as not just a purely philanthropic gesture. So I'm doing quite a lot of work on YouTube at the moment, and we can see that there are some cultural organisations like National Theatre and British Museum where they're releasing a lot of their content on YouTube as a fundraiser, so a kind of donation-based model. But we can see that those videos don't get that much. You know, they might, over their lifetime as a whole, the whole fundraising videos cumulatively might get like £1,000 or something like that. But then there's this other model used by Royal Institution and Tank Museum, where for a membership fee, starting at about like $2.99 a month, you can have a much more kind of dialogic relationship with the YouTube creators. You can suggest what you might like the new YouTube video to be. You can ask personalized questions. You can see the videos before they drop for the public. And that kind of level of digital membership creates a kind of fandom which has bigger benefits monetarily, financially, than the fundraiser model. We can see that, you know, ones like the Tank Museum are pulling in £10,000 a month from that model, compared to like £1,000 over the lifetime, which is what we're seeing from the fundraisers. But I think more important than that is that we can see a really high level of engagement in the community posts. So if you're paying $2.99 a month, you're kind of incentivized to participate, to engage, to be notified when the next video drops. And I think the value of that bottom of the funnel for the digital product is really important, and one that we tend to forget about. The sector's obsessed with growing audiences, and that's important, particularly as institutions that are funded from taxpayers' money. But it's also really important not to forget about the people that care about you most at that bottom of the funnel.
We mentioned a few kind of statistics and metrics there about the way we measure digital success, whether it's monetary value, views, followers, engagement rates. But what about the qualitative impact of content that might transform someone's understanding or relationship with culture? How can organizations better capture and communicate these deeper outcomes?
Well, I think it's good to have a mix of quantitative and qualitative measurement. So yeah, a lot of the terms that we've been talking about so far are more quantitative. But there are ways of measuring performance qualitatively. I mean, one of the tricky things I think with social media is that to some extent, your view count is not a bad metric, because a platform like YouTube will be looking at the amount of time someone's spending in a video, the amount of time people are clicking through to a video, whether once they've watched that video, they're clicking onto another video. And through whatever algorithmic processes they put it through, they will be ranking how effective that video is. So to some extent, whether your video gets seen, it's not the same as the quality someone has when they enjoy it. But basically, the YouTube algorithm is going to prioritize the number of people that spend longer in the video, which isn't a bad engagement metric. So, I mean, outside of social media, so if we're talking about like web content or something like that, then you can't, there's not the same qualitative engagement. And there are different parameters for what makes web content more visible in search and things like that. So something like usability testing allows you to see how someone gets on with a bit of content, and that might be an article or something you're trying to see how well what their comprehension of that piece is, or it might be a full user journey where you're trying to work out how easy it is to find a certain bit of content in a website navigation. So I think understanding of qualitative techniques and quantitative techniques is important to have in mind, and useful to have as benchmarks or like KPIs to see how you're doing going forward.
Yeah. It'd be remiss of us to talk about content strategy without mentioning something that probably leaves many marketers banging their head against the wall, and that's social media and their mysterious algorithms. The landscape has shifted dramatically over the years and continues to shift rapidly. How has this affected your approach to content distribution strategies for cultural clients?
Yeah, I think what is the most effective platform to use at any one time does change and will continue to change. And I think that's one of the things to be aware of, is none of these platforms have your kind of best interest at heart. So whilst you need a distribution strategy, I think you also need to be clear on what you're ultimately creating this content for, because if it's just for views, then that's a bit of a kind of tireless, you're going to continually be on the hamster wheel of like the next platform or whatever. And in sort of 20 years time, within the duration of our careers, I highly doubt that Facebook Twitter, Instagram, YouTube will still be around. So I think we've got to be thinking about what the kind of continuity of our platforms are. Our museums have been around for centuries. So the tactics that we're using to reach people will evolve quite quickly. And it's also got to be I think you've got to be a bit pragmatic about which platform you're going to go for, because certainly in the last 5 years, there's been so much volatility in those platforms, or in certain ones of those platforms, that if you put all of your eggs in one basket and then that basket gets taken over by Elon Musk or whatever, then you've lost quite a lot of capital. So it's tricky, and it's difficult to predict where different platforms are going to go. I mean, for my money, I think YouTube seems more stable than, for example, TikTok. I mean, I think TikTok is a pretty good distribution strategy at the moment, but that's not to say that I won't wake up tomorrow and find out that it's been banned in the US. So, which is obviously like a massive share of the English-speaking market. So it's a tricky one. But I think, it's partly keeping on top of where the platforms are and not being afraid to pivot, but also to be aware that the platform isn't necessarily your friend. It's a tactic to achieve your overall aim, and not to lose sight of what you're ultimately trying to achieve for society, audiences, or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really big concern. How do you think organizations should navigate this? Because obviously investing in platforms that we don't own, that could change and disappear, leads to kind of that investment possibly being wasted. And we've already seen loads of people moving off Twitter X, and especially in the cultural sector, I think Blue Sky is getting quite popular. And it's especially annoying when a lot of these platforms penalize posts that share external links, which is why not just our sector, but any business shares content on these platforms, is to try and gain traction through, links to their websites. So how do you help clients develop sustainable strategies that aren't overly dependent on specific platforms or the whims of their megalomaniac owners?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is tricky, and I think to get good at a platform, you do have to sort of invest a reasonable amount of time. And the way you get better at it is partly by publishing more to it and spending more time on it. I think cultural organisations could be a bit savvier at choosing fewer platforms to be on, because it's difficult to be good at all of them if you're in a small team. Well, it's difficult to be good at all of them, full stop. I think in terms of your point about external links, I think that's also possibly a bit of a misconception. I mean, like, I understand why people do it, but also I think if we take a platform like Facebook or something like that, and you're posting an external link on Facebook, if I, as a consumer on Facebook and scrolling through my phone, I've got to be convinced that your link is more interesting than anything else I'm going to see in my feed to click through to it. So it's a bit of a kind of anathema to the user experience for why someone's on Facebook. I mean, and why people are on these platforms is because they're kind of procrastinating and haven't thought of anything more productive to do a lot of the time. And so to kind of honor that, I think you need to create interesting, engaging content that sits in that platform. I think if you're using it mainly as a way of getting free marketing to your product, it's going to bomb, because these platforms haven't got your best interests at heart. They're not interested in promoting your website. If you want to do that, then put some money into the platform and do it as a paid ad. But yeah, thinking about how you can create experiences that are unique to that platform in that platform, rather than just try and use it as signposting back to your website. Because also, I think if you're trying to grow audiences, it's a bit of a jump to get them on your website initially, because they're probably not even interested in you at this point. So you've got to find a hook. You've got to find a way in to get them listening to you. And you've probably got to do that a couple of times before they go on your website. And for some of those, they're not even going to be realistic visitors. So have you got a digital offer or something for them? But yeah, I mean, also not going after people that are completely uninterested in you, which I think also sometimes the sector tries to do. So having a bit of a strategy about who you're targeting, and why, and where that ultimately leads people.
Just moving away from social media now, when we've spoken previously, you mentioned a tech museum, I believe in Bovington, as an example of a collection with a really niche subject that's doing really well. And many marketers and content strategists will know that being targeted and being specific is a great way to cut through the noise. But how can organizations with diverse collections like national museums adopt a similar technique?
Yeah, I think it's really tricky. And I think in the time that I've been working in web and social media, it's shifted. Because when I first started and social media platforms had evolved out of like MySpace into Facebook, the bigger museums were where it was at. You know, the very first branded pages on Facebook were what you typed in as your interest, that it had then converted into a business page and sort of inadvertently signed you up to a load of corporate pages that it could then advertise you to. But that meant that, you know, obviously there'd be a lot more people saying they were interested in the V&A than they were saying that I'm interested in the Tank Museum, because the visitor profile of the V&A is so much huger. So those big brand names back in the day didn't really have to do that much to get the biggest followings. Same as Oxford University when I was there. But now it's kind of the opposite, because what you see on your feed isn't really to do with who you followed. It's to do with what the algorithm thinks you're interested in. So the algorithm can take the Tank Museum's content and be pretty clear that it's about tanks and serve it to quite a sort of niche subset of people that globally represents, you know, a decent amount of people that's generating a lot of income for them. But if you're, the British Museum, there are so many different departments, or National Museum of Scotland, where I worked. They've got a world cultures department, they've got a Scottish history and archaeology department, they've got a fashion department, they've got a natural sciences department. They're like 5 museums smushed into one. So I think it is really tricky then, particularly if you've got a small digital team. So it was like me as digital content media manager and 2 social media managers when I was there. So, and well, for half the time it was just 1 social media manager. So what, to do that job really well, you kind of almost needed a YouTube creator for all of those different disciplines, or, you know, whatever strategy you're going for. You might argue that you needed a TikTok creator or an Instagram Reels creator or whatever, or someone that was good at short form video to do that justice. I mean, I think so. Some examples, like the British Museum, have been quite good at creating a format that works really well with a curator. So they've got their Curator's Corner format, and that works really nicely. But yeah, I think when you're a big department, it is hard because it's more difficult for the algorithm to understand what you're about, and you have to work harder if you're talking about 20, 50 different subjects to engage and retain a more generalist audience than you do if you're just talking about one thing again and again, and you can like go big and go hard on that one subject to that really in-depth group. I mean, long term, I wonder if it would be sustainable to build up little fandoms for specific departments, but it really depends on how they grow digital teams. And there have been some interesting examples, like the National Gallery employing 200 TikTok influencers to create content for their bicentenary. So it might be that you don't necessarily need to have all of that resource in-house. You can think about how you partner with existing influencers and people that have that skill set online. And when I'm talking about influencers, I'm not talking about like the Kardashians. I'm talking about people that have like a decent following on TikTok that aren't famous for anything else other than creating art content on TikTok. So yeah, there's different ways around it. Sorry, I think I've forgotten the beginning of your question again.
It's just about how they can be more specific in their comms. But I think about the different fandoms. I think it's interesting that everything we've spoken about so far around content and content strategy has been around the online space, and that's not unsurprising. You know, most people spend at least a portion of their time online, and nearly everyone is online at some point. Although let's not forget that there are some people who completely shun social media and most online spaces. And I'd argue that those people who shun social media and online ecosystems may potentially value culture more than the average person. They might value, you know, real human connections a bit more. But the online demographic still skews towards younger age groups. In light of this, how can cultural organizations adapt their digital strategy to reach older audiences or people who don't spend that much time online?
Yeah, I mean, all of my work is online, but I don't know. I guess I'm kind of inclined to challenge that. What I haven't seen is sort of a percentage of like the population that are online. So there will be some people that are older that don't have internet access, and then there's probably not all that much that I can do to help them because that is basically my expertise. But I think, also if we look at a platform like YouTube, we can see there's much more regular spread across the demographics than on a platform like TikTok or, well, any of the other social media platforms. It's quite normal for us to see around 20% for every age demographic, including the 65 plus one. So, I mean, it doesn't track above 65 plus. So, there's maybe like 80-year-olds or 90-year-olds or whatever that we're not thinking about. I think there are other departments in the museums that are better geared up to do that, though. I think a lot of the learning teams will have specific bits of funding for doing more local based initiatives with elderly audiences. But I think also there are some nice digital case studies of digital being used to engage elderly audiences. So Opera North's Couch to Chorus, which launched in the pandemic. So they had a what I would consider a proper strategy, in that they realized that when their doors were shut during the pandemic, they had a bit of a problem. That's where their revenue comes from, performances. So if you can't put on performances, your cash flow is going to take a bit of a hit. But they also had a kind of societal insight that people were at home having a bit of a tough time and not having the same access to culture that they did before. And so they created these online choirs that you could be a part of and audition for. And it attracted a slightly different audience from the people that might turn up on the door in Leeds for an Opera North production, because it was international, although I think it's got more presence in the UK. But also people that it performed well with people that were sort of having a difficult time social isolating, more elderly people, more vulnerable people, disabled people, people that for whatever reason were unlikely to return to the physical opera once it was possible for the general population to go. So, and they offered that as entirely based on voluntary donations. I think they made sort of over £200,000. So I think that's a really nice case study of digital being used to support kind of vulnerable and older audiences, but just based on a kind of quite clear perception of what sort of society needed at that point, but also fulfilling their strategic needs as a business.
It feels like ideas like that can sometimes feel like they come out of the left field. I wonder what advice you'd give to cultural organisations that want to do something like that and make their content more inclusive and accessible. How would someone go about generating an idea like that?
Well, I think, the pandemic was quite unique. And in my head, it sort of lent itself quite well to strategy because, everyone was kind of in the same boat. You could kind of predict what people's problems were, both organisations and people at home. So maintaining the status quo was not a smart option. And so kind of the opposite of maintaining a status quo is making a change, having a strategy. So we at One Further got quite a few projects that were based on cultural recovery funding and trying to come up with digital content strategies based on what we could try and predict about the implications of the pandemic while it was still running and what it was going to do for future audiences. I mean, I think now, sort of 5 years on, what would I say to people that are trying to be more accessible? I think doing, like, not just guessing about what accessibility means, so getting a proper accessibility audit done. And then if you're going to, and then trying to do or find someone that can do usability studies with whatever kind of disability it is. I mean, disability is a really broad spectrum, but some of the companies that specialize in this, like Accessible by Design, do quite a lot of work with different kinds of disability, particularly sort of those using screen readers and things like that, so that you can see how digital products perform for people that are accessing them in a completely different way to you. So I think, making sure you're getting your research done right, and maybe being clear about what you mean by accessibility. So you can get an accessibility audit, but in terms of your wider strategy, is there a particular bit of accessibility that's particularly important to you that ties into your wider digital audience development plan? Yeah.
I'm going to ask you to do something slightly impossible now and look into your crystal ball and tell me what emerging trends you're most excited about in the future for the cultural sector.
I guess it kind of depends what how long the future is. Like, if we're talking about like 50 years, 100 years. I mean, the things that I think are shifting, well, one of the ones that's quite exciting to me at the moment is that kind of shift from social media, which is more of a social graph where you're sort of mainly talking to your friends and family, to discovery engine based social media like YouTube and TikTok, where you're mainly seeing content that the algorithms picked for you. And I think that's interesting because if you know what you're doing, then it allows you to reach a much larger audience, and it's more meritocratic because it's based on well, I guess you partly interpreting the algorithm right, but also working out how the expertise that you've got sits in a kind of global landscape. So translating that to what people are interested in quite a snappy way. So I think that's interesting. I think AI is interesting, although I'm less, I think there are also concerns around that as well. And I do think that's going to drastically change the digital landscapes and the kind of conversations that we're having going forward, and job roles and things like that. So hopefully in a positive way, but yeah, bit early to see. So yeah, those are the two things that I'm kind of thinking about quite a lot at the moment.
Yeah. And finally, if you could wave a magic wand and change one thing about the way cultural organizations or the cultural sector approaches content and content strategy, what would it be?
To be honest, I think a lot of the reasons that content strategy gets blocked aren't to do with the content team. I think it's to do with the level above. So I think I'd change the perception of digital in the sector and make it not be seen as a service department and the people that turn your computers off and on again, and be seen as a sort of central part of audience development and a strategic outfit.
Yeah, I don't know if you feel the same, but I feel like that shift is slowly happening. I feel like it's becoming.
I hope so. Yeah, I think it varies a bit across the country and depending on what kind of institution you're talking about. But yeah, I think within the national institutions in London, it's pretty well recognised. But yeah, maybe less so for like council-based institutions or institutions outside of London.
Yeah, I guess if those organisations who are looking at it more closely can share their examples of how they're using their digital strategy and content strategy to boost success, that might kind of affect change a bit more quickly throughout the sector. So certainly that's.
Yeah, I think it depends if the right people are seeing that, because I think the digital teams get it, but I think it's partly that they're so much smaller outside of those institutions that have got it working quite nicely. And then I think, there are a lot of teams that sort of, yeah, if they had like double the resource, they could do quite a lot more, but they're not going to get it unless their bosses and their boss's boss start seeing the value of digital. And I think that's where a lot of things are getting stuck at the moment. But yeah, hopefully that'll change.
Yeah, that's actually been quite a common theme in quite a few of these CultureTalk podcasts, is advocacy from leadership. So certainly that's what I'd be asking for.
Yeah,
But
go ahead.
oh, go on.
I think one of the big misconceptions is that we always think about the physical audience. So you have a digital marketing funnel that goes grow, engage, convert, retain. And then when you get further down that model, people are always thinking about the physical audience. It's how do we get people into the museum or whatever. But I think there is a completely separate parallel funnel, which is like the digital marketing funnel, where you have digital membership and making money out of those audiences. And I think museums do well to think about creating a digital audience framework where you can develop audiences all the way down the digital tree. And yes, some of that will have ripple effects onto your physical audience, but it's a product in its own right. It doesn't just need to support the physical visits.
Yeah, that's exactly what I've always said as well. It's like the product is not just the events that's happening on stage and in venue. The digital is the product as well. So yeah, definitely. Well, it's been a fascinating conversation, Georgina. It's been a pleasure to kind of hear your insights. And as someone who also deals in content strategy, there's definitely a few things I'll be taking away from this conversation. So really appreciate that. So thank you for your time and sharing your insights and experiences. For those interested in learning more about One Further's work or connecting with Georgina, you can follow her on LinkedIn or visit onefurther.com for resources on analytics, content strategy, and digital engagement for cultural organizations. Otherwise, thank you for listening, everyone. If you've enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe or follow for more conversations with leaders and innovators in the cultural sector. But otherwise, thanks again for your time, Georgina. I hope the cough heals up for the rest of the week and you have a good rest of the week. Other than that, I hope to catch you again soon, and take care and goodbye.
Oh, thanks, Matt.